Okay, it's good to be here and talk about the research. Steve and I have been doing a dog and pony show, kind of not going around talking about this, but just trying to figure out how it all flows together. And we have been collaborating very closely with a team of people who we have labeled the Healing Wounds of Trauma Research Team. And so they're totally responsible with us for this presentation. This is not new information, but for context, the Healing the Wounds of Trauma program started in 2001, working mostly with African pastors who couldn't learn and couldn't minister because of trauma. Now, 16 years later, it's in 90 countries. The book has been published in 68 languages, and over 60 Bible Society and other organizations are participating in the program. Stories abound for individual change in trauma healing. However, stories only go so far. We needed data. We needed information. So put on your information gathering hats. We're going for a ride, okay? Ready? First, we have to set the context for the research study itself. The planning began in June of 2016 with 15 people from that time till now have participated in the planning, implementation, etc., overseeing the study. There were 3 aims identified for the study. The first one was to assess the impact of the program on individual symptoms of trauma and loss. The second was to assess the impact on individual engagement with God and Scripture. The third was to assess the local church's ability to be a healing community. This presentation that Steve and I have worked up is specifically focused on the first 2 of these aims. And the next presentation after will cover the work that's done to research the church's ability to be a healing community. 2,709 participants completed the Trauma Healing Impact Survey. Of these participants, 55% were in the initial part of the equipping sessions, so initial equipping sessions, and 45% were in healing groups, so fairly equally distributed. Data collection took place at 3 points in time. We're going to be referring to time 1. Time 1 was prior to the trauma healing session, where we collected baseline type of data. Time 2 then occurred immediately after the session. You could think of it as a post-test. And time 3, we collected the data 2 to 6 months after the post-test data, the time 2 data. 28 organizations gathered data for this study. I want to talk just a minute about the research survey because it's what is the basis for all that we will be talking about. The survey contains 7 story-based items, and for each item there's a 5-point response format, which you can see on the screen. The sample item here related to sleep will show that it gives a scenario of 3 people, and then they have to choose which one they're like. And Richard is always the worst in terms of whatever the option is, struggling the most. And Simon is always doing better in the scenarios, but they're not written so they're super obvious. And that's how the survey went. The surveys were translated into 7 languages. 26 countries provided research data, and they're all listed here. And without ado, we're going on to talk about participant characteristics. 8%, there were 8% more women than men who provided data for this study. Their average age was 39 years. Most of them had either secondary or post-secondary education. Even in areas where there was lesser development, you still saw higher levels of educated people in the groups taking the surveys. Most were Christian, and they reported speaking 60 different languages as their heart language, but 7 languages were spoken by 84% of all participants. Got it? What kind of trauma was experienced? There were a total of, participants were asked from a list of 12 different types of trauma, which ones had they experienced. And they had to check it off. They checked them off as either something that happened less than 6 months ago, which was recent, more than 6 months ago, which we called remote, or on the third survey at time 3, they were asked, have you experienced any of this trauma since the last time you completed the survey at time 2? And so we called that ongoing trauma. And of all those experiences tallied up, there were 13,000 different types of trauma. There were 13,000 experiences with trauma that people reported. Many people had multiple traumas. The mean number of traumas was just under 5. So people had about 5 traumas at the events. The range of traumas was from 0, there were 202 that reported no trauma, to 12, and there were 38 that reported 12 traumas. If we look at the weighting or the frequency with which the traumas occurred, on the right side of the screen are the trauma types with the number of times it occurred and the percentage. Of the total number of traumas reported, loss, disease, war or terrorism, and domestic abuse were 10% to 16% of the total traumas. Crime, disaster, and displacement were 8 to 9%. And then suicide, forced sex, kidnapping, trafficking, and we had a category of other, which we had real trouble deciphering, so we just call it other. That was 5%, 6% or lower. That's it for that one, I think. So now we say, how effective is trauma healing overall? And if we could just close the computer and walk away, because it is effective. Trauma healing is effective, according to this study at least. And we've done a good job of it, so we can believe in the data. Yay to you. The graph presents the overall change in trauma symptoms on the left side column over time. So at time 1, before the event, there was no change, obviously. They reported what symptoms they felt. Then by time 2, at the end of the trauma event, there was an improvement in the level of trauma symptoms of about 10% that then continued on to time 3, 2 to 6 months after the trauma healing event, and was above 14% improvement overall. So this was trauma symptoms, but if we charted relationship with God on the same graph, it would look very much the same. So that's the overall thumbnail, and now we're going to get in the weeds, okay? Kind of. Harriet tells me I can't do that too much, but you got to. What percentage improvement occurred in symptoms? So symptoms, we're going to look at things in three categories: symptoms, relationship to God, and relationship to self. Symptoms then, these are the symptoms that were measured on the survey tool: their overall or general status, their sleep patterns, how they handled intrusive thoughts, avoidance, their interest in life, their ability to concentrate, and hypervigilance, or were they on alert all the time. The red bars show the change at time 2 immediately after the event. The blue bars show the change from time 1 to time 3, 2 to 6 months after the event. Yes. Not the trauma event. The trauma healing event, yes. I'm not as embedded in trauma healing as all of you, so I apologize. The red bar shows a 10 to 19% improvement in these. The range was 10 to 19% improvement at time 2, and the blue bar shows a 15 to 29% improvement. So we could say all these symptoms improved. What we use a lot as we're moving forward is a summary, a composite of these changes in our analysis or presentation. A question came up from the Alliance yesterday: how many people, what percentage of the population in terms of symptoms got better or got worse? Not everyone got better, okay? But over 2/3 of the people had fewer symptoms, and that's shown in the blue bar under symptoms improved. There was about 12% who had no change, and about 20% who got worse, whose symptoms got worse, even at time 3, right, Steve? This is by time 3. So at the end of the measurement, they still had worse symptoms. Okay? But a majority improved. So we asked the question, does when trauma is experienced make a difference? Persons with fresh trauma, that recent trauma, and ongoing trauma that occurred between time 2 and time 3, had worse trauma symptoms at the start and experienced greater healing throughout once they got on board. So the fresher and the more current your trauma, the more likely you were to have higher symptoms when you got there, more symptoms, worse symptoms, and the more likely, as a result of the program and involvement, you would have higher levels of healing. Participants with domestic abuse had worse symptoms when they started, followed by those with suicide, war, and rape. These were worse than any of the other types of trauma in terms of promoting symptoms. Persons who had not experienced trauma still had trauma-like symptoms, and they still showed some improvement, but it was all at much lower levels of change. That's for symptoms. Now we're going to talk about relationship with God. Here the items tapped thoughts about God, why God allowed trauma, how they were doing with talking to God about what was going on, their engagement with the Bible, and their involvement or participation with church. The level of change here that occurred at time 2, immediately after the trauma healing program, was in the range of 5 to 8%. and that's the red bar. The blue bar shows the change at time 3, 2 to 6 months later, and that shows an 11 to 15% change. So what you see here is a delayed change. The relationship to God, the relationship to the Bible, the relationship to church, all takes a little longer to change than symptoms. Okay? And it continues. We stop measuring it at time 3, but who knows how long it continues. Now we're going to just summarize some findings and then show you graphs. For those who like the graphs, great. For those who like it synthesized, here's the words. These slides I think will be available, so, right? Yeah. So the first one is we're going to look at engagement with God, the Bible, and church in relation to symptom change. Since it looks like symptoms change faster than these relations with God, what's going on? So what we found is that as trauma symptoms are processed and people improve in their trauma symptoms, they experience increased engagement with God, the Bible, and church. And through Steve's analysis, we can say with some degree of certainty? I think so. Confidence is a better word. That this occurs in that way, that the symptoms lead to a change. Maybe not for everybody, but for the group. Yeah, as symptoms levels improve, then they're free to engage with God and Bible and church more. So, these are the kind of graphs we have. We've simplified them, okay? Let me get to it, because I actually wrote what I hope is a simple way to talk about it here. This graph shows a strong relationship between a change in trauma symptoms and involvement with God. That's talking to God, those 3 God symptoms, items. On the horizontal axis are shown 3 groups, those 3 that we talked about earlier, those that have worse symptoms, whose symptoms worsen as a result of the program, those who show no change, and those whose symptoms improve. The vertical axis portrays the change reported at time 2 and time 3, the percentage change at those 2 times. The time 2 change is in blue. If we go to those whose symptoms improved at time 2 versus those whose symptoms worsened at time 2, these are the blue bars, we can say that the decline in trauma symptoms, that people that report an improvement in trauma symptoms are 4 times more likely to report an improved relationship with God. So we have in the red box under symptom worsening are those at time, no, the blue box, sorry, at time 2, it's 4 times, but it looks more than that to me. A great improvement. That relationship for those whose symptoms were worse continue compared to those I'm going to focus on talking on those whose symptoms improve, and then you can compare it with the worst. You'll see that the people whose symptoms improved had about a 17% improvement in symptoms versus those 17% improvement in their involvement with God versus those whose symptoms worsened who had about a 4% improvement in their involvement with God. That's at time 3. It's less at time 2, and you'll notice at time 2 in the far left bottom, the people whose symptoms worsened really got bad. They got under 0% improvement. They got worse. And, but they too, well, we're not getting into that. By time 3, they were looking better, the red box. I'm going to do better on the next one, I guarantee you. This is so much fun. I just did this one. Oh, I'm not. Now we're looking at the change in symptoms in engagement with the Bible. This is all happening at time 3, 2 to 6 months after the trauma healing program completed. There are 16% who saw, for those whose symptoms improved, 16% had more engagement with the Bible. For those whose symptoms improved, their engagement was 16% improved. Thank you, Steve. As opposed to those whose symptoms worsened, where the engagement was much less, 3%. You'll notice, though, that those who had no change in symptoms tinkered a little more with the Bible, too. I wonder if it had anything to do with the nature of healing the wounds of trauma. Got enough on that? Now we're looking at the impact of change in symptoms on church involvement. And here the horizontal axis gives you what time it occurred, at time 1, 2, or at time 3, what time we're reporting the data from. I'm going to talk about time 3, and of those who reported an improvement in symptoms, that's the blue column, about 14% of them had increased church involvement. The other way around. You want to come up and help me? Say it again. Their involvement increased. Their involvement increased by about 14, a little under 15%. To me, that what you say and I say means the same. That's why I'm not getting it. And then you'll notice that those who had no change didn't change in terms of church. In fact, they got a little worse. And those who symptoms worsened those whose symptoms worsened also withdrew more from the church, but by time 3, they were above 0. They were thinking about it. So it looks to me like this church involvement thing is more complicated than we've been able to sort out. Everything is, but this one is more difficult. And I'm not surprised, personally, The other thing I wondered is, for some people, did the healing groups happen in churches or the equipping sessions? And how were they thinking of church? So, okay. Now we're going to move to relationship with self. And here we're looking at people's ability to process grief and loss, to forgive, their empathy or compassion for others, their resilience or their ability to help themselves heal from trauma, and also their perceived ability to help others heal from trauma. Here, the red bar shows a 7 to 13% improvement in relationship with self, while at time immediately after, and then 3 to 6 months later at time 3, it's a 12 to 18%. So it was increased. These means aren't as high as some of the others at time 1, nor did they go quite as far at time 2 or at time 3, but they're there. Everything we talk about is statistically significant, and some of the things that were statistically significant we're not talking about. The reason partly that that it was all statistically significant is because we had such a huge population, such a big N. But so it's got to be understandable before we talk about it or indicating something. Now we're going to move on to getting into the weeds a little more about forgiveness and grief and forgiveness, etc. The first summary slide says that as trauma symptoms are processed and people improve, they are more able to process their grief and loss and forgive those who hurt them. Here we see that those that reported improved trauma symptoms had an 18% increase in their ability to process their grief. So, and this was at time 3. It was that, as opposed to those who had no change or who symptoms worsened, those people, if their symptoms worsened, were stuck. They couldn't process their grief. In fact, their grief got worse. So we can say that it was like the intervention lifted a burden from these people who had improved symptoms and were able to process their grief. Now we're going to look at ability to forgive at time 2 and time 3. I'm going to focus mainly on time 3, and we'll reflect back. Those with improved trauma symptoms reported a 20% increase in their ability to forgive at time 3. Pretty high. And that increase was 14% at time 2. These are the blue columns. So the increase in forgiveness happened quite quickly, but it kept growing and it continued to improve in a person. The people continued to feel more forgiving across time. Those who reported no change or worsening trauma showed negative ability, and negative were less likely to be able to forgive. Yeah, and it happened more so at time 3. So if the symptoms worsen, they were kind of no changing. But then by time 3, if the symptoms had worsened, they were like in a negative rut about forgiveness. That's the orange box, which is negative. Okay? Now we'll move on to empathy and resilience. As trauma symptoms are processed and people improve, they become more empathetic and resilient. Here we see a little over 15% change in empathy for those whose symptoms had improved, and not much change for the others. If we look at personal resilience, it's pretty much the same. Resilience was a little higher, almost a 21% increase in resilience or ability to take care of self if your symptoms improved. Okay, we're getting near the end. We've got a few more pieces. In the study's data, change in trauma symptoms is the biggest predictor of improvement in people's relationship with God, Bible, and the church. By predictor, we mean it accounts for a lot of the most of the variation in the variables in the analysis. We have to trust Steve on this, and I believe him. So this, we compared various factors which might influence a person's relationship with God. And the data suggests that the factor that had the greatest influence on relationship with God, Bible, and church was improvement in trauma symptoms. And that's up here at almost 80, influence of about 80%. This suggests that dealing with trauma symptoms is an important element to strengthening churches. And that was actually mentioned in the small amount of the reports I heard this morning. In Tanzania, because of the work being done, churches are growing. So, the next most influential were empathy, 85%, grieving, and forgiving, a little lower. Altogether, these 4 factors accounted for 60% of the change that was seen in relating to God. And I must say that in relation to this, total trauma, gender, and other factors were tested, and they did not affect it. It was these that did. That affected relating to God. Oops, no. Now we're going to get into some of the more process parts of how you do trauma healing. And just to highlight, healing group participants reported greater improvement in symptom levels than those who were in equipping sessions. Okay, so it looks like the healing groups might be more effective. At least they had people that had more symptoms that needed healing or whatever, that we didn't sort out. But there were greater improvement in the healing groups. And also, smaller size groups are more effective than larger groups. This is the chart on the healing versus equipping groups, and this is statistically significant. They start out initially with no change, because that's the initial information we get. And then you'll see that the healing group in the red line has a 14% increase by time 2 that goes up to an 18% increase at time 3, whereas the equipping groups, the blue line, have more like a 7% increase at time 2 that increases to 9% at time 3. We asked, did they have different kinds of trauma? But they didn't. They all had, well, we didn't, what we looked at was the mean of the trauma experiences they had, and they had from healing group, had 4.9 mean traumas, those participants, and equipping session people had 4.6 mean number of traumas. So it wasn't the number of trauma experiences that made the difference. And here is the slide about the impact of size of a group. Groups range from 1 to 50. The easiest pattern to see is the red bars, which are at time 3, where the smaller the group, the bigger the change in trauma symptoms. That's at time 3. If you look at the blue bars at time 2, it's more varied, but still we've got that general slope. We looked at if having the rape lesson included made a difference. And we found that people with forced sex or rape as the trauma experience greater healing if they receive the rape lesson. So the rape lesson makes a difference for those people. FS on this graph means forced sex, which was the term we used because it's a more comprehensive term than rape. And here you see, okay, the columns on the left are those who didn't get the rape lesson, and the columns on the right are those who got the rape lesson. The flesh-colored and light blue column for those are those who had rape plus any other number of traumas. Those people did fairly well regardless of whether they had the rape lesson or not. Although they did better when they got the rape lesson, and significantly better. It's still the bar, they made improvement without it. However, if you only had rape, and that's the red column under no, and the blue column, if you only had rape and you didn't get the rape lesson, you didn't improve at all. However, if you only had rape and you got the rape lesson, you improve more than anyone else in this graph. So your improvement was a little over 19%. So the rape lesson makes a difference. One more data and then we got to quit. Participants who listened to the audio trauma healing, in addition to the classic, reported a greater positive change in terms of both trauma symptoms and relationship to God. This is this. Trauma healing, audio trauma healing was available in 7 of the 26 countries the study was done in, and 31% of participants listened to them in addition to doing the classic trauma healing. So the purple bar, the lavender bars here are those who only did classic trauma healing, and the purple are those who did both classic and audio. And you'll see here that both in terms of symptoms and relationship to God, the audio, the addition of audio made a pretty big difference. So the conclusion is that we think trauma healing works. It's making a difference. It's having a big impact. People are helped, especially those who experience direct trauma. As symptoms are reduced, relationship to God and the Bible improve, and the church can help in working with this. We'd like to thank, as the research team would like to thank everyone who helped make this study a success, especially those who completed those surveys and provided the data that we needed to do this work. Thank you.
My name is Matt Kistler, as she mentioned, and I'm presenting alongside Bryan Gouge, and we are members of Global Scripture Impact. That's that last word, GSI. So our work here within ABS is to help evaluate, to measure, to learn from what our projects are doing, learn about what our impact is. So as Harriet mentioned, Fred Barraza went out and collected 35 interviews among church leaders in 4 sites, 2 in Uganda, Kampala and Gulu, and 2 in Rwanda, Bugesera and Kigali. And just as a note, Gulu was an area heavily impacted by the Lord's Resistance Army civil war, and Bugesera was an area of intense genocidal violence. So the questions that were asked of the pastors were looking at how the trauma healing curriculum had impacted their ministry, how it had impacted their community, and what challenges they had faced. And as, again, Harriet mentioned, each site had 3 years of exposure. So we're hoping to see over time, how does trauma healing sink in within a community? So again, the purpose of these interviews was to get a better picture of how and why changes occur within communities once a trauma healing intervention is introduced. While the individual information that Grace presented focuses more on the scale of what happened within individuals, the data we're presenting now provides a narrative, a rich narrative of what it actually looks like as a community changes. So I'm going to pass things over to Bryan to share more about how we interpreted and analyzed these 35 surveys.
So Matt and I had the great privilege to be able to read through all of the experiences, the stories, the narratives of church leaders, of people in the community. And for me, that is what this is all about, looking at stories. That is what people hold on to, that's what they communicate, and it is the most rewarding part of doing research. It also happens to be the most challenging part of doing research because you're left with all of these experiences, and as a researcher, you're trying to understand what are the themes, what are the patterns, how is this all connected? So we sat down, and one of the ways that we went about doing that was first establishing a framework. How do we understand the data? We used a methodology called grounded theory, and I'm not going to go into all the specifics about that. Matt and I would be happy to talk later about what that means, but for us, this is a methodology I think that really works in cross-cultural settings because one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't have any preconceived biases about what you think is going to happen. You actually look at the data with very open eyes, with an open mind, and you don't look at it saying, I think these are the outcomes. You approach all of the experiences, the narratives, and you begin to read through, you begin to listen with a very humble posture, and then you begin to code or sort of tag what you think is being said here. What is the real essence of the story? So Matt and I kind of took all of the interviews, all of the stories, and split up, and we both began to read through them. And we began to pull some of the topics, some of the themes that we were noticing. One of the ways we did that was by, if any of you are in a conversation with somebody, and I know you could probably relate to, if somebody mentioned something 3 times, you're like, that's important, I should take note of that. So frequency was a way that we said, well, this came up 3 times, this is important, let's start to code that, let's start to kind of keep track of that. And the other one is by kind of how much affect or emotion or importance is being communicated in the story here. So what you'll see is some of these things, as we begin to look through, people would explicitly state I began to spend more time with people in the community. I began to fellowship. Okay, that's very easy, that's explicit. But sometimes it was more implicit. You had to kind of pull from that. It wasn't said directly, but it seemed to be what they were talking about. So as you'll see here, on the right-hand side, you'll see the number of times. That's the number of times it was mentioned, or this topic was mentioned throughout all of the interviews, which, I mean, I'm not going to go through every single one of those. Matt is going to unpack a little bit about what each of those mean. But you'll see some of them like fellowship, empathy, awareness. These kind of things popped up over and over and over again in the interviews, and we were really encouraged by that. So the next step was to, going back, take all of these themes, say, what do these have in common? Well, one of the things that we found was we grouped all of these themes with three larger things. These big themes were, how is this impacting the church? How is this impacting communities? Well, we split that up into three areas. Changes that happen within oneself, and that might be like awareness of trauma, awareness of yourself, being able to say, I'm sleeping better. That is an increased sense of awareness that you have about yourself and your sleep. And then movement toward God. And that kind of looked very differently. We grouped a lot of things into that, but one of the things that we saw was that where people held a view of God as distant, as separate from them in their suffering, after they experienced God as with them, present, connected. And then movement toward others, and that's sort of like interpersonal communication, interpersonal restoration. People were kind of crossing tribal lines. People were more than forgiveness, but coming to a place of reconciliation. So these are like the three themes, and then we had those more comprehensive, smaller topics that I talked about. Matt is going to come back up and talk about how we then all connected this together.
So hopefully you'll be getting a handout momentarily with this helix that we created. What we were trying to do, as Bryan mentioned, the challenge here is trying to take 35 interviews worth of information and communicate that. How do you tell that story in a simple way? And so what we saw, first of all, was that we had two different paths being walked. First was a path being taken by pastors and the churches they represented. Churches were changing. And then secondly, we saw how individuals were being impacted. Individuals were changing. And we saw a lot of points where they were changing in the same way, and then some places where, just by the nature of who they were, they changed differently. And so to kind of embody that, we decided to use this helix, which we sometimes add a little A in there for helix. Right, so that's our little joke. We use that shape to kind of describe this movement together as they move together toward a healing community. So I want to use the rest of our time just to briefly walk through this, because I do want to get to the discussion questions you'll see on the back so that you can be thinking about how this might be useful and applicable to your work. So as we start on the institutional pathway, which you see on the top, starting at the left there, the first place where leaders got introduced to the trauma healing curriculum was through equipping sessions primarily. And the first impact that they noticed was a greater awareness of themselves and their trauma. One, for example, gave this quote: "As a result of trauma healing, first of all, there's one thing I've really gotten about me. I have understood myself. I mean, I've also been traumatized in one way or another." And so as church leaders really began to understand themselves and their own trauma, their first shift was a growth in ministry and pastoral care. And so what we mean by here is pastors beginning to care more for their community, for their church community. And so this might look like one-on-one counseling sessions, or it might be, introducing people to the healing groups. Here's another quote that kind of embodied that idea. "Before, I never wanted to be close to people." This was a pastor. I used to despise everybody. But these teachings are helping me to get close to church and serve others. So there was a real freedom to be able to re-engage with the church community by the leaders. And by the church is, so the leaders represent the church. And so as people are meeting with their pastors, they're beginning to see, the church is with me on this. So as they begin to listen to others, leaders and the churches develop empathy, which then moves toward spreading trauma healing ministry and activism. So what do we mean by that? Now that they are thinking about trauma healing within the church, they take it out, right? They take it to their community. They start to think, this isn't just important for us here in the pews, this is important for everybody. So they start to think, how can we go to market with this? How can we go to a funeral and share this message? How can we go to the remote communities that we are far away from and share this idea? How can we even go to Muslim brothers or sisters? Many of them mentioned that this was an effective way to build bridges where, maybe other means might not be open, but talking about trauma was something that that could transcend those barriers. And so by the end, you see new vitality within the church. You see churches that are alive with growth. You saw salvations, increased scripture engagement, and just greater connection with the church. And as Grace mentioned, these are themes that you saw within the quantitative data as well. So really these two streams of data are complementary as you understand kind of what's happening at the individual level and at the community level. So now starting back at the left again with the individuals, they follow a very similar path. They understand their own trauma. That's kind of the first step. And then next, they start to open up. That was the one thing that was reported the most. People started to share their story more. And I think a lot of that has to do with the safe space that healing groups provide. So here's a quote. You see how people start behaving differently. You see how people start pouring out even things they had put aside or shelved. So as they share their stories together, individuals within communities build empathy for one another. They begin to understand one another, and that naturally leads you to a place of beginning to consider forgiveness and reconciliation. So that might look like, actually one of the primary ways we saw was families being reconciled, husbands and wives that had split apart or were really in a difficult place relationally, were able to come together and find healing there. We saw that across denomination, where churches that didn't work together before now had a forum and kind of a framework to understand and work together. And that could be cross-tribal, so that, in Rwanda, here you have Hutu and Tutsi. Now you started to see quotes about we're working together, we're worshiping together in ways we didn't before. Another quote, these people are back. They are active choir members. They're active members in the fellowship. For us as a church, we really appreciate that trauma healing program because we see them back and there's some stability. So once relationships are restored, people desire fellowship. They come back to church and they re-engage with their community and with their God. And so as you think about this helix as a combined entity, you see people moving from a place of isolation, from being disconnected, from being closed off, unable to share their story, to what we're calling a healing community, a place where individuals feel welcome, where they are together, and they feel free to share what they've experienced. So that is kind of the heart of the helix. Now I want to give a few disclaimers as we move forward. What we're representing here is what we saw in the data. And that was collected in East Africa. We do not claim or assume that it describes what any of you have been seeing or experiencing, which is of course equally valid. So I hope if any of you are saying, I don't know how much this fits for us, that's okay. We want this to be a starting place. Each context may have a different pattern of change. However, we do think there are some ways that you can use this, even if it doesn't entirely line up with what you've experienced, as you go back and continue to think and work and serve people through the trauma healing curriculum. So three things that we thought of is, one, refining this model. We would love for you to take this home, which is why we gave you a handout, and think about how can this be adapted to your context. We want you to try it, to think about it, to change it. Let us know, because that would be great too. So that what you see within your context can be kind of captured within this framework. And why do we want to do that? Because of the other two things. Using this kind of framework helps us develop mileposts and metrics for our programs. Ultimately, for many of us, I think the impact we want to see is not only at the individual level, as critical as that is. We want to see communities transformed by the power of Jesus Christ. And so we need ways to capture that. And by having a framework that looks at this community level change, you're able to start measuring these things so that we can learn and better serve, improve our performance together. So I think the Helix is a kind of a generative tool to start creating metrics. You can just take what you have here and say, oh, well, how many is growth in ministry and pastoral care? Does that relate to my context? Well, let's start measuring it. Maybe that can be an indicator of change starting to happen within a community and help us know, this community need more support? Do we need to do something different to better help it get engaged? So I see the gong being struck and the cane coming out. So what we want to do is move to small group discussion, which the questions are on the back. How well does this framework communicate trauma healing in your community? We want you to think about this. And how might you change it to better fit your context? So we hope that you have some good discussion here. Again, people are going to, if you have questions for us or other questions for Grace and her team, you can write them down. People are going to go and collect them, and then after about 10 minutes, we're going to have a Q&A. So thank you very much.
Your questions, your fresh questions from looking at the data, it would be helpful to have a handout, I know, so you could really look at it. This was the first time we presented the findings, and we're still, as Grace indicated, finding things in the data. With the short time we have, I'd just like to ask Steve if you could comment, how significant are these findings, the findings that Grace presented? Is it like 20%, oh yeah, well, it should have been 50, or 20%, wow, it usually is like 2?
Oh, it does? Okay.
Yep.
The issue of how much change or reduction in trauma symptoms should a person experience to be considered improving or to have improved or to have dealt with the issues that traumas have brought to them is not a straightforward one to answer, and one that I wrestled with in doing data analysis. We have approached this research project, or at least I have in my thinking, by saying this is a first big step as far as this kind of assessment of the impact of trauma healing, and especially in developing country contexts. It will take, I suspect, a lot more experience and a lot more research and data gathering to be able to answer that question forcefully. For myself, as I've spent a lot of time immersed in the data, my sense, my conclusion is, or has been, it appears that a pretty small amount of change in terms of the way the survey was designed has a strong impact on people's lives and their ability to cope with the issues that confront them. You saw in the graphs ranges or reductions that range from a few percent to up to 20–25%. And you also saw that the change increases through time. Since this was a fixed-term study, we don't know how much additional change is going to take place. My sense from spending a huge amount of time in the data is that the sorts of changes that were being reported that to some of us look like relatively small percentages are in fact measures of pretty major changes. That is, changes large enough to lead to very substantial changes in personal lives, in relationships, and in institutional change. But it will take more time before we collectively, the broad community, have a good feel for how much change in a measurable sense leads to change in a personal, relational, institutional sense. That comes with experience and more time and more research.
Was there any difference in country level when we looked at the country level differences in impact or factors?
We looked at, we compared all of the countries and statistically, there were no differences there that we felt we could say, well, this data indicates that country X is really not doing very well in terms of traumas, or country Y is in great shape. We saw essentially the same sorts of traumas and the same sorts of impact of the traumas regardless of country. So people are people, trauma is trauma, and it seems like they're relatively equally distributed. Not so much in terms of the types of trauma, but in terms of the impacts of the trauma. They seem to be relatively equally distributed. And the improvement that people experience also seems to be largely independent of the country from which they're from.
Thank you, yeah. So, I mean, that does say one thing. This isn't like something that works in one cultural context, but not in others. It seems to be effective with men and women with, different countries. There was one thing, one of the cards said that someone's bias was supported, that trauma healing first, then followed by the equipping session, revamp the book to separate these two. That probably is maybe a bias, but I don't think that this data speaks to that issue. It does say both for healing groups and for equipping sessions, smaller sizes seem to be more effective. It doesn't mean you should do one-on-one counseling. It's still a group, but I think both of them had change in trauma symptoms. People from equipping sessions had lower trauma symptoms to start with than those in healing groups, right?
They had more extreme traumas.
The healing group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The healing group.
The healing group started with more trauma and ended better. The equipping session, obviously, those are people trying to help others. Were also helped in a very significant way, but not quite as much. Now, there's a lot of questions about the people who got worse. Like, I think we like to think that this is the best thing since sliced bread for every person who does trauma healing, and that is not the case. And I think this tempers our, what would you call it? Crusaders' euphoria, enthusiasm to the reality that this helps, as different graphs said, like more than 2/3 of the people are significantly helped. Some are, really not changed much, but there are some who are negatively affected. You don't want to say anything about that, or do you? Can you?
Well, I'd rather somebody else with a technical background.
Technical, Phil, Diane. Diane, maybe you have an idea, Diane. Oh, goody. You have to give your idea, or you can do it at the mic there, right by you.
Oh, there you go. From a clinical perspective,
This is
which
what
is
we
mine, oftentimes people who come in with very significant trauma begin to look at it and talk about it, and they get worse. And it's a sign of improvement. Because what it means is they're gradually facing the truth, not only of what happened to them, but how it has affected them. And they're overwhelmed by that, which is why we have to do the work little by little. So what you could be measuring, it could be a mix of things, obviously, but what you could be measuring is the fact that people ended up facing their trauma more, and so now they feel the effects more, and you have a downward spiral.
And I think the data, we have this curious phenomenon in the data, we're still looking at it, but that people with no trauma did better at time 2, and then at time 3, they did a little worse, and that would explain why They didn't think they had trauma. Now all of a sudden, they've got work to do, and it's going to take time.
The other thing is that because of this getting worse, you finally are aware of what trauma is and what your symptoms are. What you thought you rated yourself at time 1 doesn't hold anymore, and so it's a measurement problem as well as a personal problem.
Okay,
I want to add a little bit.
please do.
Okay. Someone.
You can't do that. You can add but not.
Okay. Someone at the table I was sitting at raised the issue or mentioned, well, maybe we need a time 4 or a time 5. And I think as I was doing analysis, that was one of the thoughts that occurred to me, that what we are observing in the data points to a process, not a punctiliar result of what's happened finally and forever. And that at some point, there needs to be some further tracking of individuals or processes in order to strengthen the process, and especially to provide support for those who, as we measure them, they're still early in the process of recovery, not later in the process of recovery.
So another idea that came is to do a follow-up, some other kind of trauma healing session with a group, maybe 6 months later, to, as Steve is saying, more continued interaction with people in small groups, doing research, of course, with children. We did not have children in this study, and that's a whole nother, yes, we're getting there, but we had to do this before we could do that. Okay, so I think what we can say, healing the wounds of trauma, how the church can help, and sometimes we're asked, can the church help? You guys aren't specialists, you're not mental health, what are you doing? You're gonna do damage. What does this have to do with the church? Because we're about the Bible. And I think this data shows us that ordinary people around the world, in America, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, can make a difference. And the church can really, it has something. And that this reduction in trauma symptoms is the first step to engagement with God. We've been saying it, now we have some data to really stand behind it. So thank you, everybody. The work is far from over, because when you have data like this and you like it, you can really just keep slicing it up.